Emma Walker moved silently across the gleaming floor of the armory, her mop gliding back and forth like a ship cutting through calm waters. To most who passed her in that crowded building, she was invisible. Marines hurried past, checking weapon racks and signing off requisition forms. Navy SEALs, temporarily stationed for joint exercises, carried themselves with the casual confidence of men who had seen too much. And in the middle of that chaos, Emma existed like a shadow, present but overlooked. Her uniform, faded from endless washes, bore no ribbons or combat patches. Auburn hair tucked neatly into a bun, expression calm and composed. She looked like a maintenance worker going about her day. No one would have guessed that only 2 years earlier she had been in the heat of Afghanistan, sprinting through a kill zone with shrapnel tearing into her shoulder and bullets hissing inches from her ribs. Emma had grown up in a quiet Tennessee town where military service was stitched into the family fabric. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran, had raised her on stories of grit, loyalty, and sacrifice. Those tales were not just bedtime stories, they were lessons. He told her that honor meant standing up for something greater than yourself, even when no one was watching. So, right after high school, Emma enlisted. She didn't want an ordinary life. She wanted one that carried weight. She became a combat medic, and during her first deployment, she learned what it meant to patch up men under fire, to make split-second choices when lives hung in the balance. By her second deployment, she had already earned respect among her unit. That respect, however, came at a cost. It was a roadside bomb outside Helmand Province that changed everything. Emma's convoy had rolled straight into a nightmare. The blast lifted vehicles into the air, flipping them like toys. Smoke and dust filled the valley, and enemy gunfire poured down from the ridges. Most people freeze in moments like that. Emma didn't. She crawled into the open 3 times, dragging wounded Marines back to cover. Each time, enemy fire stitched the dirt around her, kicking soil into her mouth and eyes. A bullet grazed her ribs, and shards of metal tore into her left shoulder. But she saved 4 men that day. 4 fathers, brothers, sons who made it home because she refused to leave them. For that, Emma received the Bronze Star for valor and the Purple Heart. To her, the medals meant less than the sight of those men embracing their families on the tarmac. That was the real reward. But glory fades quickly. Her injuries and the invisible weight of trauma eventually pushed her into non-combat duty. Instead of battlefield medicine, she was handed a mop, a supply list, and orders to keep the facilities in order. It was still service, she told herself. Every role in the Corps mattered. And yet, as she pushed that mop through the long shadows of the armory each morning, she felt pieces of herself slipping away. The morning of the incident began like any other. Emma rose before dawn, slipping on her uniform with mechanical precision. The Tennessee girl inside her, the one who once dreamed of proving herself, seemed far away now, replaced by the quiet custodian Marine. She carried a folded requisition form in her pocket, the same kind she had filled out dozens of times before. It was nothing complicated, just a request for fresh cleaning supplies. As she stepped to the supply counter, she reminded herself to keep calm. She slid the paper across the steel surface towards Sergeant Robert Davis, the man in charge of supplies. Robert was a career desk Marine, someone who had never deployed but carried himself with an air of smug superiority. He rarely looked at Emma as anything more than background noise. This morning was no different. He skimmed the paper, glanced at her, then smirked. His words came out sharp, loud enough to carry across the room. "Why don't you get a real Marine to sign this for you, sweetheart?" The sentence hit Emma harder than the shrapnel had years earlier. Conversation slowed. The clatter of weapon checks and inventory lists seemed to fade as Marines within earshot turned their attention toward the counter. Some pretended not to listen, but their silence was heavy, their curiosity obvious. Emma's chest burned, but her voice remained steady. "I am a Marine," she said quietly, her tone clipped and controlled, "and I have authorization for those supplies." Robert chuckled, tossing her paper back onto the counter with a flick of his fingers. Please. You're a Mop Pusher, nothing more. Maybe you'd be better suited for laundry duty." The words, meant to cut her down, sliced deep. Emma stood rooted. gripping the counter until her knuckles whitened. Inside her pocket, she felt the folded edge of her Purple Heart citation pressing against her thigh, a reminder of both her sacrifice and her struggle. Behind her, among the SEALs checking their gear, one man, Michael Reyes, watched the exchange with narrowing eyes. He didn't move yet, but his jaw tightened, and his fists flexed open and closed at his sides. For Emma, the insult was not just about her. It was about every forgotten Marine, every fighter reassigned, every sacrifice dismissed. And though she stood silently in that moment, a storm churned inside her chest. The room went still, as if the air itself held its breath. Emma stood at the supply counter with Robert's mocking words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Every Marine and SEAL in earshot had heard it, yet no one moved. Silence can wound more deeply than words, and Emma felt the sting of both at once. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from the old familiar surge of adrenaline, the same rush she had felt in Afghanistan when lives depended on her. Only now, there were no bullets, no enemy snipers, only the cutting smirk of a man who dismissed her as if her service had never mattered. She tightened her grip on the edge of the counter until her knuckles blanched. For a moment she thought of her grandfather, the man who had taught her that respect was not something given, but something earned. She had earned hers in blood, and yet here she was, treated as if she were no more than a janitor trespassing in a warrior's hall. "I told you," Robert sneered, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "This paper needs a real Marine's signature. Don't waste my time." Emma's jaw clenched. She wanted to shout her record, to throw her medals on the counter and let the Bronze Star speak for itself. She wanted to tell him about the night she dragged 4 bleeding Marines from the kill zone while her own shoulder bled freely. But the words caught in her throat, heavy with humiliation. Around her, the room shifted. Marines busied themselves with their work, pretending not to listen, though every ear strained for the next words. A group of SEALs exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. One of them, Michael Reyes, kept his eyes fixed on Robert, his jaw tightening with each insult. Emma forced her voice to remain calm. "Sergeant, this form is properly signed and authorized. I just need basic supplies to complete my duties." Robert leaned over the counter, smirk twisting into a sneer. "Sweetheart, I don't care what little chore you think you're doing. You're not a combat Marine. You're a Mop Pusher, a mascot in uniform." Laughter broke out from a couple of Marines at the back of the room. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to ignite the fire burning inside her. Memories of Afghanistan surged like ghosts. The rattle of gunfire, the grit of sand in her teeth, the metallic tang of blood in her mouth as she crawled to reach another wounded Marine. She remembered the screams, the chaos, and the way she had shut it all out, focusing only on saving lives. She had faced death without flinching. But this humiliation, delivered in front of her brothers-in-arms, felt far worse. Robert picked up her requisition form, studied it for a moment, then tore it cleanly down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed like a shot. He let the pieces drift to the floor with deliberate contempt. "There," he said coldly. "Now you don't have a form. Go find something else to clean." The entire armory seemed to freeze. Conversation stopped. A wrench clattered to the floor, dropped by someone who had forgotten they were holding it. Emma's breath caught in her throat, rage and shame twisting inside her like barbed wire. She wanted to pick up those pieces and shove them back into his hand, to demand the respect she had earned with blood and sacrifice. Instead, she stood frozen, fists trembling at her sides. Michael Reyes had seen enough. From his spot near the weapon racks, he shifted his weight forward. His teammates noticed, watching him carefully. Michael was not a man known for rash decisions, but the set of his jaw and the flicker in his eyes said something had changed. He clenched and unclenched his fists, fighting the urge to step in too soon. Emma bent slowly, picking up the torn pieces of her form. Each fragment felt like another reminder that her service, her sacrifices, were being reduced to nothing more than a joke. Her throat burned, but she swallowed the tears that threatened to spill. She would not let Robert see her break. "Maybe," Robert added, his tone dripping with mockery, "you'd be more useful in the kitchen, or laundry, something more your speed." That was the final blow. A ripple of unease spread across the room. Even the Marines, who had been quietly amused, now shifted uncomfortably. They all knew the line had been crossed. Yet no one spoke. The bystander effect held them in place like chains. Emma straightened, the scraps of paper clutched in her hand. She thought of the Purple Heart folded in her pocket, the symbol of the bullet and shrapnel that had scarred her body. She thought of the 4 Marines who were alive because she had risked everything for them. She thought of the silence of this room, a silence heavier than gunfire. And in that silence, she realized something painful. On the battlefield, she had never once felt as alone as she did now. Michael Reyes took a step forward. His teammates glanced at him, recognizing the shift in his posture. The room had become a stage, the drama unfolding with every second of silence. Robert didn't notice. He was too busy basking in his own cruelty. Emma held her ground, back straight, eyes locked on Robert. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words cut through the stillness. "You don't have to respect me," she said softly, "but I've already earned it." The words hung in the air, raw and unshakable. Robert blinked, momentarily caught off guard. But before he could reply, the room began to shift again, this time because someone else had finally decided to move. Michael Reyes stepped forward, his boots striking the floor with deliberate force. The room turned toward him, the air thick with anticipation. The confrontation was no longer between Emma and Robert alone. Something larger was about to erupt. The sound of boots against polished concrete echoed like thunder in the hushed armory. Michael Reyes moved forward with deliberate steps, and the air shifted as if the entire room had tilted toward him. Every Marine and SEAL present felt it, the weight of a man who had seen combat, who carried the authority of lived experience rather than empty arrogance. Emma's eyes flicked toward him for a brief second, confusion mixing with dread. She didn't want anyone's pity. She didn't need a savior. But there was something different about Michael. His presence wasn't born of sympathy. It radiated something sharper, like steel drawn across stone. Robert, oblivious to the storm gathering before him, leaned back with a smug grin, clearly enjoying his stage. He tapped his fingers lazily against the counter, looking at Emma as if she were nothing more than an annoyance. "What did I tell you?" he drawled. "Quit wasting everyone's time." But his words no longer carried the same sting. The shift in the room was undeniable. Marines who had been pretending to focus on their tasks now stood motionless, their eyes darting between Robert, Emma, and the tall SEAL making his way forward. The atmosphere was taut, a string stretched to breaking. Emma felt her throat tighten. She could still taste the dust of Afghanistan, could still hear the cries of the wounded echoing in her mind. She remembered crawling across burning ground, each breath a prayer, each movement defying death itself. She remembered the heat, the blood, the smell of gunpowder that clung to her hair for weeks. She had faced all of that without breaking. And yet here she stood, fighting tears in front of her brothers in arms. The silence was worse than the humiliation. No one had spoken up. Not one Marine, not one comrade had dared to challenge Robert. That abandonment stung deeper than his insults. Michael stopped a few feet from the counter. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something fierce. He bent down, gathering the scraps of Emma's torn requisition form from the floor with slow precision. Each piece he picked up carried the weight of an unspoken message. This humiliation would not stand unchallenged. Robert let out a derisive laugh. "What's this, then? A SEAL picking up after the cleaning crew? Must be a slow day." The smirk froze when Michael's gaze snapped upward, sharp as a blade. His voice, though quiet, carried across the entire armory with effortless authority. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" The question cut through the room like a whip crack. Every Marine turned, the weight of those words settling heavy in their chests. Robert blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "She's a mop girl," he muttered, though his tone wavered. Michael straightened, holding the torn pieces of paper in his hand. "No," he said evenly. "She's a Marine who crawled into a kill zone 3 times under fire, who pulled 4 of her brothers out while bleeding from her own wounds, who was decorated with the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart while you sat behind a desk counting inventory." The color drained from Robert's face. His smirk collapsed into something pale and brittle. Murmurs rippled through the room, the silence broken by whispers of recognition. Some of the Marines lowered their eyes, shame flushing their cheeks. They had heard fragments of Emma's story before, but hearing it laid bare by someone else, a SEAL no less, made it impossible to ignore. Emma froze, her breath caught in her chest. Hearing her story spoken aloud, stripped of her own restraint, was both painful and liberating. She hadn't wanted to speak of it, hadn't wanted to sound like she was clinging to past glories. But now Michael's words pulled her sacrifice into the open, undeniable and undeniable. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Michael's gaze silenced him before he could. The SEAL's voice dropped lower, steady as a hammer striking steel. "I've seen bravery. I've seen cowards. And I know the difference. She's more of a Marine than you'll ever be." The weight of his words settled heavily. No one moved. The entire room seemed to bow beneath the force of them. Emma felt her eyes sting, but she held herself steady, back straight, chin lifted. She would not cry. Not here. Not now. Then Michael did something no one expected. He unslung his rifle, the weapon he had carried through deployments, the weapon considered sacred by every warrior. Without hesitation, he placed it gently into Emma's hands. A murmur rippled across the armory. The gesture was more than symbolic. A warrior's rifle is never shared lightly. By giving it to her, Michael wasn't just defending her honor. He was acknowledging her as his equal, as one of them. "Warriors carry weapons," Michael said quietly. "Not mops." Emma's hands trembled as she gripped the rifle, not from fear, but from the surge of emotion that flooded her veins. For months she had felt invisible, reduced to menial work, stripped of the identity she had bled for. And now, in front of everyone, someone had seen her again, not as a maintenance worker, not as a forgotten veteran, but as the Marine she truly was. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of complicity, but of realization. Marines shifted, some lowering their heads in shame, others staring at her with new respect. Robert stood stiff behind the counter, pale and trembling, his arrogance shattered. Emma lifted her eyes, scanning the room. For the first time in months, she felt the weight on her chest begin to ease. The rifle in her hands was heavy, but the recognition was heavier still. And in that moment, in that armory filled with silence and shame, Emma Walker was no longer invisible. She was once again what she had always been, a Marine. The rifle gleamed under the harsh armory lights, cradled in Emma's trembling hands. For a moment, no one breathed. The sound of humming fluorescent bulbs filled the silence like a warning siren. Every set of eyes locked on her. It was a scene no Marine expected to witness, a Navy SEAL willingly disarming himself, handing over his weapon in recognition of a fellow warrior. It was an act that defied unspoken rules, an unthinkable gesture that carried the weight of centuries of military tradition. And in that instant, the armory was no longer just a place of supply. It became a courtroom. Every Marine, every SEAL present, became witness to a verdict that cut through arrogance, through silence, through prejudice. Robert's smirk had vanished entirely. His lips pressed into a thin, colorless line, his eyes darting around the room for allies who no longer existed. Those who had once chuckled at his cruelty now stared at the floor, shame rising in their throats like bile. Even those who had stayed silent shifted uncomfortably, their silence a heavy chain they could no longer defend. Emma's chest tightened as she gripped the rifle. Its weight dragged her back to memories she thought she had buried. She saw herself once more in the heat of Afghanistan, dirt in her teeth, bullets snapping overhead, the desperate cries of her brothers urging her forward. She remembered pressing her shoulder against bleeding wounds, whispering promises to the injured that they would make it home. She remembered pain, but also pride. Now that pride returned, carried not by medals pinned to a uniform, but by the raw acknowledgement that someone had seen her for who she truly was. Michael stood tall beside her, his presence filling the space like a wall of steel. His voice, calm but sharp, rang out so every corner of the room could hear. Respect is not in patches. It's not in ribbons. It's in actions. And she has given more for this corps than most will ever know. The words hit with the force of artillery. Heads bowed. Even hardened men, who had fought their own battles, shifted under the weight of his truth. Robert stammered, his hands fumbling with a pen on the counter. I didn't know. I wasn't aware of. Michael's glare silenced him. Not knowing is no excuse. Every Marine, every soldier, carries battles you can't see. And you mocked her because you saw Mop instead of the warrior behind it. The humiliation that had once clung to Emma like chains began to fall away. She stood taller, her chin lifted, her grip on the rifle steady. For the first time since her reassignment, she felt her spine straighten with the certainty that she was still the same woman who had faced fire without flinching. Marines began to move now, one by one, stepping forward. They didn't say much, some whispered apologies, others gave silent nods of respect. But the shift was real, the tide of shame turning into recognition. The room that had once been her cage of humiliation had now become a place of vindication. Robert, pale and sweating, scrambled to reprint her requisition form. His hand shook so violently that the pen slipped twice before he managed to scrawl his name. He slid the paper across the counter without a word, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Emma took it with calm dignity. She didn't gloat, didn't sneer, didn't waste breath on vengeance. She had already won the battle that mattered, the one for her worth, her identity. Michael gave a brief nod, as if to say you never needed saving, only recognition. Then, just as deliberately as he had placed the rifle in her hands, she extended it back to him. Her voice was low but firm. I carried mine once. I don't need yours to remind me who I am. Michael accepted the weapon with quiet respect, his eyes softening for the first time. He knew the gesture had already served its purpose. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't heavy with complicity, but charged with change. Every Marine in that room had seen something unforgettable. A line drawn in steel between arrogance and respect, between cruelty and honor. Emma tucked the requisition form into her pocket, the paper rustling against the folded Purple Heart citation she always carried. For the first time in months, the weight of that medal no longer felt like a reminder of what she had lost, but proof of what she still carried inside. As she turned to leave, heads turned with her. Eyes that once glanced past her now followed her with acknowledgement. Not pity, not empty courtesy, but something far deeper. Respect earned through sacrifice, recognition restored by truth. Outside the armory, the sun blazed against the parade grounds, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Emma walked through them with steady steps, the echo of Michael's words still ringing in her ears. Respect is not in patches. It's in actions. And in that truth, she felt her spirit stir again. For the first time in a long while, Emma Walker no longer felt invisible. She felt seen. News traveled fast on military bases, faster than vehicles, faster than official reports. By sundown, what had happened in the armory was no longer a private humiliation. It was a legend in the making. Whispers spread through the barracks and mess halls, carried from one Marine to another. Every retelling added weight to the moment when a SEAL had handed over his weapon to a woman once mocked as just a mop pusher. For Emma, the aftershock was immediate. Her phone buzzed that night with messages from former squad mates, men she had dragged bleeding across Afghan soil, men who owed their lives to her grit. They had heard the story already. They told her they weren't surprised. About time someone stood up for you. One wrote. Another. You've always been a Marine's Marine, Emma. Don't ever forget it. Her old commanding officer even called, his voice gruff with restrained anger. I'll be making a report, he said. This never should have happened. But Emma didn't want vengeance. She wanted change. The morning after, she walked into the armory again, requisition form in hand. This time, Robert barely raised his eyes. His once cocky smirk had dissolved into silence. He signed her paper with trembling hands, pushed it forward, and muttered something that sounded like an apology, but was too broken to be whole. Emma didn't reply. She didn't need to. The battlefield had already spoken for her. But the real change came weeks later. Senior leadership could not ignore the storm of reports, whispers, and testimonies pouring in. A quiet investigation began, not just into Robert's behavior, but into the culture that had allowed such disregard to fester. Emma was reassigned. Not as a punishment, not as a consolation prize, but as recognition. She was pulled from cleaning duty and placed in a training position. Her combat experience, once ignored, became the foundation for teaching new Marines how to survive. The first day she stood in front of recruits, her chest felt tight. She looked at their young faces, eager but untested, and she remembered being one of them, hungry to prove herself, unaware of how much the battlefield would demand. She taught them not only how to apply a tourniquet under fire, but how to keep courage alive when fear threatened to consume them. She told them that medals fade, records fade, but the lives you save, the bonds you build, those are eternal. And the recruits listened, not because she wore medals on her chest, but because they could see the truth etched into her every movement. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived it, bled it, carried it. Meanwhile, the base itself began to change. New policies were introduced, emphasizing respect across all roles. Leaders reminded their Marines that every uniform told a story, whether marked with patches or faded from use. Training sessions focused on dignity, on seeing the warrior within, not the task assigned. Robert was sent to mandatory counseling and corrective training. He avoided Emma whenever possible, his arrogance dulled into uneasy silence. For her, that was enough. She didn't seek his downfall. The lesson had already been delivered in front of an entire room of witnesses. One evening, weeks after the confrontation, Emma sat at her desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. On it, she wrote a simple message of gratitude to Michael Reyes. She thanked him not for saving her, because she had never needed saving, but for reminding the others what they had failed to see. She enclosed the note with a promise. Your gesture gave me back my voice. I won't waste it. She had borrowed his rifle for barely an hour that day, but in truth, she hadn't needed to hold it. What mattered was that someone had recognized the warrior she had always been. Emma folded the letter, sealed it, and returned his weapon with it. She didn't need to keep the rifle to prove who she was. She had her own history, her own scars, her own record carved into the memories of those she had saved. Standing on the training grounds weeks later, Emma felt something stir in her chest she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't reduced to the background. She was shaping the next generation, passing on lessons written in blood and grit, and the story of the armory spread far beyond her base. To some, it was a tale of humiliation. To others, it was a reminder of courage. But to Emma, it was something deeper. It was proof that silence can be as dangerous as a bullet, that respect must never be conditional, and that true brotherhood is not found in titles or patches, but in the courage to speak up for those who are silenced. As the sun set behind the barracks, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, Emma walked across the parade ground. Her boots struck the pavement in steady rhythm, each step echoing with renewed conviction. She thought of the 4 Marines she had saved in Afghanistan, of her grandfather's lessons, of the moment Michael had placed his rifle in her hands. She realized then that courage wasn't something she had lost. It had only been waiting for her to see herself again. And now she did.